Women are bad investments, Sarah. You just need to keep your face pretty until you find a husband to pay your bills. My father looked me dead in the eye and said those words when I put the payroll report on his desk. I had just discovered that my brothers Austin and Tyler were making $200,000 a year with full benefits and equity. I was making $50,000 with zero benefits because he had classified me as a 1099 contractor. "Stop whining," he sneered, checking his watch. "I did you a favor. Your brothers are building a legacy. You're just temporary." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I felt a cold, sharp click in the back of my brain. I realized right then that he wasn't my father anymore. He was just a bad boss, and I knew exactly how to destroy a bad boss using the very contract he forced me to sign. I picked up my bag. "Hey," I said, "if I'm a contractor, then today is my last day." He laughed as I walked out. He thought I was throwing a tantrum. He had no idea I was about to use his own greed to burn his entire empire to the ground. In the high-stakes world of New York event production, there are two types of people. There are the face men like my brothers Austin and Tyler. They wear $5,000 bespoke suits. They show up at 11 o'clock in the morning holding a latte, ready to take a client to a 3-hour lunch at El Bernardine. They smile, they shake hands, and they promise the moon. And then there are the ghosts. That was me. I was the one on the headset at 3 o'clock in the morning negotiating with a Teamsters union rep who wanted to shut down a runway show because Austin forgot to file a noise permit. I was the one physically moving 20-pound floral centerpieces in my heels because Tyler had sent the crew home early to save money for his bonus. I was the one who knew the birthday of every major client's child. The one who knew which brides needed hand-holding and which CEOs needed hard data. I lived in a state of perpetual adrenaline, always moving, always fixing, always invisible. I remember one night, specifically the launch of a new luxury watch brand at Hudson Yards. The kind of event that makes headlines, the kind of event that screams prestige. The kind where the lighting has to be perfect, the sound needs to be flawless, and every detail matters. An hour before doors opened, the lighting rig failed. We were on a tight schedule. Austin was at the bar downstairs chatting up some model. He didn't even answer his phone when I tried to reach him. I didn't panic. There was no room for panic. I climbed a ladder in my silk blouse, bypassed the breaker, and rerouted the power from the backup generator. When the lights blazed on, Austin finally strolled in, clapped me on the shoulder, and said, "Great job, sis." I didn't get a thank you. No recognition. Nothing. He didn't even stay to check on the event. He took the credit, took the commission, and I took the subway home because Uber's search pricing was too high for my budget. Looking back, it seems insane. But that was the trap of the good daughter syndrome. My father, Richard, didn't just steal my labor. He stole my ability to assess my own worth. From the time I was little, he'd tell me how reliable I was, how I was the glue. He would tell me that Austin and Tyler were wild, their incompetence was charming. But me, I was the dependable one. I was the one who always picked up the pieces, who always fixed the messes. I thought that being the glue, the one who held everything together, was an honor. But it wasn't. It was a trap. My worth had been reduced to being the helper, the one who solved problems, but never got to be seen as part of the bigger picture. I thought suffering was loyalty. I thought if I just worked hard enough, if I saved them from enough disasters, eventually they'd recognize my value. They'd see me as more than just the help. They'd see me as an equal. But I was wrong. They weren't waiting for me to prove myself. They were banking on me, never realizing I already had. They didn't want a partner. They didn't want someone with my potential. They wanted a mule, someone who could work endlessly without ever questioning the system. When Richard made me a contractor, it wasn't just a financial decision, it was psychological warfare. By denying me benefits, equity, even a job title, he kept sending the message, "You're not one of us. You're temporary." But he made a mistake. He forgot that the help sees everything. While they were out there enjoying their fancy lunches, I was the one learning everything. Every wire, every contract, every flaw in the system. I knew how the machine worked inside and out. I was the one building it, and I knew exactly which wire to pull to make it all come crashing down. They had no idea how much I had learned, how much I understood. The realization hit me slowly over time that I was the engine. I wasn't just working for them. I was the one keeping everything running, and they were taking all the credit. They were living off the sweat of my labor while I stayed in the background invisible. I thought that if I just kept working, eventually they'd see me as more than just the ghost. But the more I worked, the more I realized that they never intended to see me at all. They just wanted me to keep working until I burned out. And in their eyes, I was expendable. But I knew better now. I knew that I could change things, that the time had come for me to stop being invisible, for me to finally take the power back. My father Richard had a way of making everything seem like a favor. When I was younger, he'd tell me how reliable I was, how dependable I was. It felt good at first being the one he could count on, being the one who made sure things didn't fall apart. But over time, I realized that's all he ever saw me, as the one who picked up the pieces, the one who never asked for anything in return. To him, my worth wasn't in my ideas, my intellect, or my creativity. It was in my ability to be useful, to be the glue that kept everything together, even when that glue was stretched so thin it was barely holding. He trained me to think that my labor, my suffering, was my price for existing. When I first started working at Mitchell & Company, I was eager. I had my degree from Wharton, a sharp mind for strategy, and a passion for the event industry. I thought my talents would be valued. I thought that if I worked hard enough, I would be seen, and eventually my contributions would be acknowledged. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized that I was invisible. I was constantly being told I was the reliable one. But what did that really mean? It didn't mean I was a partner or even a co-contributor. It meant I was the one who did everything behind the scenes, while the faces of the company like Austin and Tyler took the glory. Richard had a special way of making me feel small. It wasn't that he outright insulted me, at least not all the time. He didn't need to. His tactics were subtler, more insidious. He would undermine me with his words, devalue me without even realizing it, or worse, he realized it perfectly, but did it anyway. I remember one specific conversation where I brought up the fact that I had been doing the work of a director without the title. He laughed and told me, "You're not built for the spotlight, Sarah. You're good at the details, and that's where you belong." He didn't just belittle me. He made me believe that my role, the one I was working my ass off for, was somehow lesser. Like I was too small to have any real power, too safe to ever make a true impact. In the beginning, I didn't know better. I thought if I just kept my head down, kept working harder than anyone else, I'd eventually be recognized. But the more I worked, the more I realized I wasn't getting anywhere. I was always the one staying late, the one fixing problems no one else could be bothered to deal with. I was constantly scrambling to put out fires that Austin and Tyler were too busy to care about. They'd walk in at noon looking like they had just come from a photo shoot, while I'd already been there for hours, making sure the events went off without a hitch. And when it was time for the accolades, they were always the ones who received them. They were the ones who took credit for everything while I stood in the background invisible. Richard reinforced this every chance he got. He would tell me that my brothers were building a legacy while I was just temporary. He made sure I knew my worth in his eyes, that I wasn't important enough to be treated with respect or to have a seat at the table. It didn't matter that I was the one who knew the contracts, who understood every detail of the production process. What mattered was that I wasn't important enough to be included in the bigger picture. When I confronted him about my lack of title, about how my brothers had full benefits, equity, and respect, while I had none of that, he dismissed me with a wave of his hand. "You're just a contractor, Sarah," he'd say. "Don't make this more complicated than it is." It wasn't just about the title, though. It was about how he saw me. He didn't see me as a partner, as someone with the skills and abilities to be an equal. He saw me as a tool, a mule, who existed solely to keep the machine running smoothly. He never saw me as someone with potential. In fact, he actively kept me small. It was psychological manipulation. At its finest, he made me believe that I was the problem, that if I just worked harder, proved myself more, everything would be different. But no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I sacrificed, I was never given the recognition I deserved. It was like running on a treadmill, always putting in the effort, always pushing, but never moving forward. Eventually, I started to see through the lies. The more I worked, the more I began to recognize that I wasn't being treated as a valued team member. I was being exploited. I was being used to make the company function, but never acknowledged for it. I was the one fixing the mistakes, dealing with the stress, and carrying the weight, while they played at being the public faces of success. The worst part was that Richard made me feel like this was normal. He made me feel like it was my job to work tirelessly in the shadows, and if I dared to ask for more, I was being ungrateful. The truth was, I wasn't ungrateful. I was being manipulated. I was being kept in my place by someone who knew exactly how to make me doubt myself. It wasn't until much later that I fully understood what was happening. I wasn't just being kept in the background, I was being erased. I was being set up to be forgotten, to fade into the background as the empire was passed down to my brothers. But the more I saw, the more I realized that I wasn't just an employee. I was the one who built the engine. I wasn't the help. I was the one making the company run. And once I realized that, I knew it was time to stop being invisible. Time to stop letting my worth be defined by others. The moment it all snapped for me was when Austin missed a critical deadline. We were working on a launch party for a Japanese tech conglomerate at the MoMA. Everything had to be perfect, the kind of event where the details mattered more than the guests. The catering deposit, $75,000, was due by noon. Austin was supposed to wire the money. Instead, he was at some strategy lunch drinking wine with clients, acting like his job was just about looking good. It wasn't the first time he dropped the ball, but it was the first time I saw how deep the manipulation ran. At 2:00 in the afternoon, the catering company called me furious. They were pulling out because the payment hadn't been made. The event was 2 days away. Panic started to creep in, but I knew what had to be done. I marched into Richard's office and told him what had happened. Instead of calling Austin or trying to fix it, Richard looked up at me with that same detached look. He always had when I was the one with the solution. He didn't seem angry, didn't seem concerned. He just wanted me to clean up the mess again. "Fix it," he said dismissively. I explained the problem. The money was gone. There was no way to make the payment now. But Richard just stared at me over his reading glasses, the corner of his mouth twitching like he was trying to control his temper. "Call them back," he said in that low, dangerous voice. "Tell them it was a clerical error on your end. Tell them you wrote down the wrong routing number. Take the heat off your brother." I was stunned. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about my integrity. He wanted me to lie to a vendor I'd known for years. He wanted me to make myself look like the incompetent one to cover up for Austin's mistake. It hit me in that moment. He wasn't just treating me like the help anymore. He was willing to sacrifice my reputation, my credibility, just to protect Austin. And all because it was easier for him to do that than to hold his son accountable. I stared at him, unable to comprehend the words coming out of his mouth. "You want me to lie to cover for him?" I asked. "Austin is the face of this company, Sarah," he said in that cold, matter-of-fact way. "Clients need to trust him. You're back of house. It doesn't matter if they think you're a little scattered. Just get it done." The words hit me like a slap. "Just get it done," he said. It didn't matter if I was sacrificing my professional credibility. It didn't matter that I had worked tirelessly for years. To Richard, I was just a cog in the machine, a tool to be used when needed, discarded when not. That was the moment I broke. I had put up with so much over the years. The pay disparity, the lack of respect, the constant reminder that I was temporary. But this was the last straw. It wasn't just about the money or the title anymore. It was about the fact that my father had been erasing me, minimizing me for years. He didn't see me as someone capable of being a leader, as someone who had been doing the work all along. He saw me as a problem solver, someone who could fix things without ever being recognized for it. He had never wanted me as a partner. He had wanted me as a mule, someone who worked and never asked for more. I took the call, I lied, and I took the blame just like I always had. I listened to the catering director call me unprofessional and a liability. I swallowed it, just like I had swallowed every insult, every underestimation, every demeaning word from Richard and my brothers. But when I hung up the phone, something shifted inside me. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep letting them treat me like this. I walked back into Richard's office, my voice steady but firm. "I want a title change," I said. He looked at me, rubbing his temples like I was asking for something ridiculous. "I want to be named Director of Production," I continued. "I want it on the website, and I want it on my business card." Richard sighed, the familiar sigh he always gave when he thought I was being unreasonable. "We've talked about this, Sarah," he said, brushing it off like it was no big deal. "It's an optics issue. Our clients, they're old school. They like dealing with the men for strategy and you for the details. If I make you a director, it confuses the hierarchy. It makes Austin and Tyler look less authoritative. Let's just keep things as they are. You're good at being the helper." The helper. The word echoed in my mind. That was how he saw me. That was how he had always seen me. But that day, something inside me clicked. I wasn't the helper anymore. I wasn't just a piece of the puzzle to be moved around and discarded. I was the one who had been doing the work. I was the one who had been the engine running the entire company behind the scenes, while they took all the credit. The truth was, they didn't want a partner. They wanted me to stay small, stay invisible. And that realization, that deep systemic erasure hit me like a freight train. Richard had built his empire on my labor, my sweat, my intellect, and he never once acknowledged me for it. He had erased me from the narrative, made me feel like I was disposable, but no more. I wasn't asking for a title. I wasn't asking for recognition. I was demanding it. I had worked too hard for too long to be invisible any longer. It wasn't until later, when I was sitting in my apartment one night, staring at the contract Richard had made me sign, that I realized something. It had always been there in black and white, but it never clicked until now. I was a 1099 contractor, not an employee. That was the big loophole. I had been so focused on the pay disparity, the lack of benefits, the frustration of being invisible, that I hadn't stopped to truly read the fine print. But now, with everything falling into place, I saw the one thing Richard had never considered. He had forgotten to have me sign away the intellectual property rights to my work. I had written the Titan Gala script. I had designed the stage layouts. I had created every detail of the show, down to the lighting schemes and the flow of the event. All of it, every single element, was my work. And according to United States copyright law, as a 1099 contractor, the work I created wasn't owned by the company unless it was explicitly transferred. It wasn't something Richard could take for granted. The truth was, he had used me as an asset without ever giving me the credit, without ever recognizing my contributions. But now I held the keys to everything. It hit me like a tidal wave. Everything I had done for Mitchell and Company, every project, every campaign, every show, they were mine. They weren't owned by the company. They couldn't just be taken from me. I had created all of it, and by not signing over those rights, Richard had handed me a golden ticket. He had been so obsessed with cutting corners and saving money that he had unknowingly made me the owner of everything he had built. I knew I had to act fast. I couldn't just sit on this information and hope it would work out. This was my chance to take back what was rightfully mine. I reached out to a friend from college, David, who had become an intellectual property lawyer. He was known for being aggressive, and I needed someone who understood the system and wasn't afraid to fight. We met at Sterling and Finch, one of the most prestigious firms in Manhattan. As soon as I slid the contract across the table, David's face lit up with a grin. "Is this a joke?" he asked, laughing as he scanned the paper. He couldn't believe how poorly Richard had handled it. David explained that under the work-for-hire doctrine, everything I had created belonged to me, not the company. He tapped the paper and said he saved money on legal fees, but in doing so, he saved himself into a grave. I could barely contain the excitement building inside me. This was it. I wasn't just going to fight for recognition. I was going to take everything from him. We filed for expedited copyright registration with the Library of Congress. It cost $800, but it was the best money I had ever spent. I wasn't going to let Richard get away with erasing me, with treating me like I was nothing. This was my work. And now I had the legal power to prove it. The night of the Titan Gala, I walked into the Plaza Hotel with a sense of calm I had never felt before. It wasn't the same nervous anticipation I had once felt running around in the background, hiding in the shadows. No, this time was different. This time, I wasn't just showing up as part of the crew. I was there to claim what was mine. The ballroom was dripping in gold crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. The air thick with perfume and power. Billionaires shook hands with senators while my father Richard held court near the stage, looking every bit the part of the man who ran the show. But as I walked through the main doors in a crimson gown that looked like armor, I wasn't invisible anymore. The security guard, the one I had hired years ago, nodded at me without a second glance. He didn't stop me. He knew who really ran the show. I saw Richard before he saw me. He was in the middle of a conversation with a senator, his smile wide, his demeanor confident. But then his eyes caught mine. There was a flicker of recognition, but for a moment I could see the confusion in his eyes. He didn't expect to see me there standing in front of him. Not as his daughter, but as someone who had taken control of the very thing he had built. When recognition hit, his smile faltered. The air between us thickened, and I could feel the anger bubbling up in him, that familiar, controlling rage. He started to move toward me, but I didn't wait for him. I turned away from him and walked straight to the head table where Mr. Vance, the billionaire funding the gala, sat. I'd already made sure everything was in place. This was my event now, and Richard wasn't in control anymore. Mr. Vance looked up at me surprised. "Sarah, I thought you left," he said. I smiled and handed him a thin black folder. "I did," I replied calmly, "but not my work." Inside the folder was my federal copyright registration for the Titan Gala script lighting and run of show, topped with a court-stamped cease and desist. "The show you're about to watch is stolen," I said, handing it to him. "Mitchell & Company doesn't own it. I do." Vance skimmed the papers, his eyes flicking between the highlighted 1099 contractor status and the truth that was laid out before him. He looked up at Richard, who was now rushing through the crowd, his face twisted in panic. Vance looked back at me, his voice calm but firm. "Is your crew ready?" I nodded. They never left. As Richard approached, breathless, I nodded to the booth. The signal was given. The lights flickered, the massive LED screen suddenly glitched, and then flashed the words, "Intellectual property of SM Productions. Unauthorized use prohibited." A sharp silence fell over the room, broken only by the clinking of glasses. Richard's face drained of color as he stepped onto the stage, trying to salvage the situation, trying to control the narrative. But it was too late. I grabbed the microphone, standing tall, red gown blazing. "For 6 years, Richard Mitchell refused to pay me a salary," I said, letting the words hang in the air. To save $15,000 a year in payroll taxes, he classified me as a 1099 contractor. He forgot one crucial thing: the contract didn't transfer my intellectual property. The room was still, everyone listening intently. Richard's eyes were wide, his face contorted in disbelief. "This is my event," I said, holding up the cease and desist. "And I'm issuing a cease and desist effective immediately." The realization hit the room like a bombshell. I turned to Vance, who stood up from his seat. "Is this true? Is she a contractor?" he asked Richard. Richard stumbled over his words. "It was just for taxes." Vance cut him off. "That's not a technicality. That's incompetence." He turned to me, his tone shifting. "You own the show." "I do," I said, looking Richard dead in the eyes. Then, with a final crushing blow, Vance turned to the crowd. "Richard, you're fired. Get off the stage. Sarah, continue the show. Invoice me in the morning." The applause erupted, the room filled with a buzz of disbelief and excitement. Richard stood frozen, his world crumbling around him. I stood there watching him, feeling nothing but triumph. For 6 years I had been invisible, used, erased, but not tonight. Tonight, I was in control. Tonight I had taken back everything they had tried to take from me. Standing there watching my father's empire crumble, I realized how far I had come. For years, I had been trapped in a cycle of manipulation, my worth defined by others. My father, my brothers. They all thought I was just a cog in their machine, but tonight I wasn't just cleaning up their messes or staying in the shadows. Tonight, I owned everything I had created, every idea, every moment. I had broken free from the chains they tried to put on me. I wasn't just reclaiming my work, I was reclaiming my independence. No one could ever erase me again. If you've ever felt like you were invisible or like your hard work didn't count, remember, you are not defined by others. You have the power to take back what is rightfully yours. This is just one story of empowerment, but there are so many more. If you want to hear more stories of justice, of fighting back, and of standing tall in the face of adversity, don't forget to like and subscribe. Join me as we take control of our own destinies together.